Do you want to know the most overpowered strategy in the game? It's easy. Hit your opponents when they can't hit you. It's that easy to win games. We're half joking, but kinda not. Having a range advantage over your opponent is actually one of the most impactful things in a game. Being able to dictate when you get to hit them without giving them the option to hit you is obviously really strong. The problem is that players don't abuse their range advantage nearly as much as they should be. So in this guide, we'll be covering some common mistakes where lower elo players aren't pressing their advantage as much as they should be, resulting in significantly less pressure during the laning phase. And just to add a bit more to that previous point, this is what we constantly teach and cover on our vast set of courses over at Skillcapped. The game needs to be played completely differently in your elo compared to what you see in pro play and high elo streams. We teach you the right way to climb from the low elo perspective. If you want to climb quickly and learn how to deal with bad teammates, then check us out after this. In fact, we're so confident in our teaching methods that we have a money-back guarantee on our service, which no other coaching platform would dare to provide. For our first example, if we're talking about range advantage, then a Caitlyn replay should not be too surprising. She's paired up with a Brand versus Jinx and Leona. Caitlyn definitely has the range advantage in this lane over Jinx, especially with her ranged support. It also doesn't help that Jinx and Leona aren't the most natural of solo queue pairings, which means that the lane should very often look like this. It should feel very hopeless for Jinx, and trades should end up going favorably for Caitlyn in the long run since she can land significantly more harass due to her range advantage and having the caster support on top of that. Unless Leona somehow lands a clean all-in, then this should be how things will look most of the time. So, knowing how the lane should go, let's skip ahead a bit to a later point in the lane. Things seem fairly similar to what we just witnessed. Again, due to their range advantage, there's really not a lot Jinx and Leona can do to fight back at the moment. That is until this next wave where Caitlyn is about to make a monumental mistake all too common in these kinds of lanes. You see, she and Brand were quickly ganked by Rek'Sai, putting an end to their earlier pressure. Caitlyn, not wanting that to happen again, opts into warding as the wave has crashed into her opponent's tower. This is good, but what happens next is the problem. Caitlyn is very lazy about how she enters back into the lane. She should walk to where Brand was standing, but she kinda just does nothing and goes into the middle brush to let the wave and lane state reset completely. And as a result, Leona gets to creep into the lane brush. Here's a big takeaway that you need to remember. Your range advantage is way more impactful if it is very difficult for your opponents to approach you. The easiest way of visualizing this concept is to imagine yourself as Ziggs in mid lane during the later stages of the game. For bot lane carries, Ziggs has about as good of a range advantage as you're going to get. Now imagine that there is a Nautilus behind you in the left side jungle, and an Olaf behind you in the right side of the jungle. Obviously, your range advantage becomes meaningless here. Having higher range is only relevant when you can reliably maintain max distance and easily prevent your opponents from reaching you. Now compare that to an example where everyone is just standing in front of Ziggs and there's no flankers. Anytime they walk up, Ziggs chunks them and easily kites back, making it very difficult for them to approach. We're not trying to make that sound like a revolutionary concept, but it is something that players tend not to actively think about during the lane phase. With that in mind, do you remember what happened back in the lane? Caitlyn's passive play allowed Leona to get into this brush. This isn't as bad as the Ziggs example we just discussed, but it does raise issues for Caitlyn and Brand now. Instead of being able to hold their opponents back from a single approach, Caitlyn now has to worry about Jinx's advance from this angle and Leona's advance from this angle. This clearly makes it difficult for both Caitlyn and Brand to maintain their range as they had been before this moment. And that leads to this next mess. Do you see how Leona is able to approach much more easily by having access to this brush? The fact that she could even walk up and press her E from this angle was Caitlyn's fault for losing so much pressure in the lane. Now, it isn't her fault that Brand continued to press forward after Leona missed her E, but as always, that's not the point of our guides. Brand's death could have been avoided if Caitlyn never gave Leona an opportunity to engage in the first place. The main takeaway we want you to understand from this replay is that you should actively be thinking about how you're zoning your opponents and what type of approaches you may be giving them by not abusing your range more aggressively. If Caitlyn had positioned here immediately after warding, then Leona has to remain by Jinx's side near her tower. Then, maintaining her range and zoning her opponents would be a much easier task. We're not saying that Brand doesn't have the possibility of dying in that scenario, but it'd be far less likely since Leona and Jinx wouldn't have as strong of an approach as they got due to Caitlyn's mishap. Moving on to another all too common issue we see from players is not utilizing their spells properly to get the benefits of a sort of momentary range advantage. A ton of ADCs tend to have on-demand high-range slows in their kit, such as Miss Fortune, Twitch, Varus, Ashe, Kog'Maw, etc. There's a reason that quite a few of these champions have historically been considered powerful laners. A lot of that has to do with the fact that their abilities provide a lot of the benefits of a typical range advantage. The main benefit of having higher range than your opponent is often just about being able to pick and choose your battles. Slowing someone is effectively the same thing. You can catch up to them to force a trade or kite away to disengage. Again, we're not trying to blow your minds here, that's fairly simple stuff, but many ADCs don't think about their slows in this way. They just use their spells randomly or not at all, instead of abusing their powerful long-range spells to engage and disengage fights whenever there's a good opportunity to do so. Again, let's look at a Platinum Elo game where this Varus will fail at what we've just mentioned. For starters, at level 1, he opted into Q, which is already a telltale sign that he's not really sure what his champion's main strength is. This causes him trouble on the second wave as the enemy duo hits level 2. There's more than just one thing going wrong here, but imagine if Varus understood the value of his E in this instance. He could E the minions and both slow the Kai'Sa and Yuumi so they can't use their level lead to get a good trade on them. Instead, he tries to last hit the minion normally and gets punished heavily for his lack of understanding about maintaining proper distance from his opponents. Not only could his E be used defensively, but you need to be on the lookout for moments when your opponent is mispositioned to punish as well, like this timing, when Kai'Sa walked way too far up. Yuumi is useless here, since there's a bunch of minions to block Q, and Kai'Sa has no W, and here Q's damage would be very spread here. If Varus E's, he and Nami can get in range for a quick burst trade to punish Kai'Sa walking too far up. Basically what we're getting at is that these long-range slows serve as a sort of pseudo-range advantage in a lot of cases. You can choose when to disengage or force the issue. But Varus didn't ever use his E in that way. He only ever pressed it randomly for a bit of poke, or to score a last hit here and there. It just goes to show that he doesn't really understand the value of one of, if not his most powerful ability in lane. His inability to capitalize on it makes Kai'Sa and Yuumi seem like the superior lane duo, as if they're some sort of insane poke lane. In reality, this should have been one of the easiest laning phases of all time for Varus, with a much better matchup due to how hard Varus and Nami outrange this lane. The next concept we see a lot of ADCs fail at understanding is playing around how the minion wave affects the relative range of both ADCs. Plenty of marksmen have abilities that extend or lower their range due to a minion wave. The simplest example of this would be Ezreal. His range is really potent when nothing is blocking his Qs, but obviously he's a very short-ranged ADC if he can only rely on his auto attacks when someone is standing behind a wave. Other examples would be stuff like Miss Fortune, Jhin, and Lucian, who can use their abilities through minions to extend their effective range. One of the most important things you need to do as an ADC is constantly thinking about this concept relative to your opponent's champion. If you do so, you'll sometimes feel like you have a 300 range advantage over them the entire lane phase. For example, in this matchup, Ashe is incredibly favored versus Zeri if she plays well. The reason is simple. Ashe's volley outranges Zeri's Q auto attack by a significant margin, so outside of minion waves, Ashe is very dominant. And when it comes to their regular auto attack range, Ashe is quite favored there as well, which means that if both ADCs are hiding in a wave, Ashe once again comes out on top. If you properly apply that information, then you could make Zeri's life a living nightmare playing Ashe. Let's watch how this low elo Ashe fails to do so. At the start of the lane, she's trying to cheese Zeri if she walks this way from Lee Sin. Zeri takes the safe route, so Ashe comes out of the brush and W's her. Think about what we just talked about. Should Ashe continue fighting Zeri here? Yes or no? You should immediately know that this is an awful trade to extend. Remember, Ashe only has the range advantage outside of minion waves with her W. Otherwise, Zeri will outrange her. Obviously, Ashe isn't considering this at all and goes for a very awkward trade onto Zeri, which should have gone much worse. She got really lucky that every Enchanter player in low elo is just an AFK shield bot. Lulu could have definitely punished her much harder for this misplay. Despite the poor trade, Ashe is still so favored in this lane that she could easily stomp anyway. Do you see how this minion is walking up towards Zeri's casters? Ashe could take advantage of this random minion RNG and position to hit and zone Zeri by just keeping the minion between them. Once again, the point would be to abuse her range advantage relative to the minion wave. Instead, she just positions very, very far back and doesn't really manage to achieve anything. The way the lane is being played, you'd think that Ashe and Nami are supposed to go even versus Zeri and Lulu, when that is not the case at all. This is such a favored lane matchup for Ashe, but not a single one of her trades ever tries to make use of her range advantage in this lane. She's just playing normally without giving much thought to how she's approaching Zeri, so the lane goes even for the most part, which is a colossal failure. Once again, it just highlights how even Platinum players are oftentimes not playing around their range advantage, especially when it is based on minion waves. To quickly recap before ending things, here's the important takeaways from this video. 1. When you have a range advantage, you should actively be trying to keep your opponent from entering areas where they can more easily close the gap on you. Pressuring both your lane opponents to always stay in front of you, where they have to approach from a very obvious angle, is one of the best ways to punish a short-range lane. 2. When loading into a game, always think about how the minion wave can impact both you and your opponent's effective ranges and use it to your advantage. And lastly, a smaller but relevant tip is to consider the usage of your long-range slows more tactfully. Don't just use them randomly or only during trades. Use them to cover weak points where you need to keep your opponent at bay or to punish your opponents when they may have potentially mispositioned. Alright guys, before we wrap this up, let's tell you a little more about Skill Capped. So, we offer a 5-division rank up guarantee and think that's a pretty crazy thing to offer. It's like a gym membership guaranteeing you'll get ripped. Your local gym would go bust if they offered that, right? Not us. We've offered this for years because our service really does work. It works so well, in fact, that we're able to produce by far the largest catalog of premium league guides on the internet. We add over 20 videos a week, with over 1,600 guides curated into over 100 courses no one can compare. We've also sent Challenger players into ELO Hell 714 times and counting, where they commentate how to carry live. They also respond to all questions asked. Sign up today for as little as $6.99 a month if you are serious about improving. Anyway, that's a wrap on this guide, guys. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.